So now I want to talk a little bit. Remember I said earlier, I said there were some different things that could activate or increase histamine, and one of them is the menstrual cycle. So ladies, listen up to this part, because the menstrual cycle, we know the chemical that degrades histamine, that serum diamine oxidase, so again, that chemical we just got done talking about, diamine oxidase, we know that during certain parts of the menstrual cycle, this chemical is lower. Okay, and so you can see here serum DAO, that's diamine oxidase levels during the luteal phase were significantly higher than during the follicular phase. So let's break that down and break down what that means. DAO was increased during the luteal phase. Okay, that means DAO breaks histamine down. So this chemical that breaks histamine down was higher when women were in their luteal phase of their cycle. What is the luteal phase? You look over here, you can see luteal phase is between days 14 and 28, and the big hallmark of the luteal phase is that there's a lot more progesterone being produced during this time. Now, researchers aren't quite sure why the DAO is higher during the luteal phase, but the suspicion is that it's a estrogen-progesterone flip, meaning your progesterone shoots way up, your estrogen comes down. And so we think that the hormone cycle has a lot to do with why DAO is higher during that time. So this is important to understand, because if you have, during your menses, if you have migraine headaches, then this might actually be caused as a result of histamine release. And so again, this is the time, this follicular phase is when your DAO levels are lower as compared to your luteal phase. So it may have something to do with you not being able to regulate the histamine quantity. So again, one of the tips that we often see work really, really well for women is to put them during their cycle, during this phase, about a week before menses, is we get them to eat lower histamine and kind of prepare them for that switch. And when they do that, a lot of times the migraine headaches completely clear up. So just kind of an FYI for those of you still menstruating, and if you're struggling again with those migraine headaches or other symptoms of high histamine, right during when your cycle starts, it's important that you understand that. Now, we also know, I'm going to blow this up for you, that mold is a major activator of mast cells. So you see your impact of mold on mast cell cytokine immune response. So activated mast cells, MCs, release performed mediators, including histamine. So that's something I was just telling you about, is mast cells release histamine, right? So mast cells activated by fungi, which is mold, provoke an increase in prostaglandin D2 levels and lead to hypersensitivity disease, meaning the more of this stuff you produce, the more hypersensitive your body becomes as it relates to reacting to things. And this is why we get the symptoms, many of the symptoms in the respiratory tract, like eyes and recurrent sinusitis and bronchitis and cough, and neurological manifestations like fatigue, nausea, headaches, and brain fog. As a result, again, the mold stimulating mast cell release of histamine, right, leads to lots of those different types of problems. And so this is why a lot of people that are living in mold and have mold in their environment, some people are allergic to mold, but I'm more specifically talking about toxic mold exposure. You can develop a lot of this type of manifestation living in mold or being surrounded in mold. So just, beware of that, because that I see a lot in people, especially down here in the Gulf Coast, where we have so much humidity and the potential for mold growth. Okay. And then this next one, what would a show of mine be if we didn't talk about gluten? And so in this recent pilot study, recently published, association between migraine, celiac disease, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and activity of diamine oxidase. So here we are at DAO again, right? So again, follow along with me, DAO. And so what these researchers found in their pilot study is that 9 out of 10 patients with non-celiac gluten sensitivity had decreases in DAO activity, meaning that if you had non-celiac gluten sensitivity, you had decreased DAO, which means you had increased histamine, because you had less of an ability to break histamine down in your food. And what we think happens here in this situation is that, just going back to what I said a minute ago, as the causes of histamine intolerance is that GI inflammation. As that gluten creates inflammation to the GI tract, it reduces the DAO. When you don't have adequate DAO and you can't break down dietary histamines, those histamines build up. And again, when you build up histamines in the body, you get the symptoms associated with too many histamines, one of those being migraine headaches. So a lot of times we'll see people that have gluten sensitivity struggle really badly with migraines. What happens when they go gluten-free? The migraine goes away. This is one of the pathways as to why that occurs, outside of the fact that gluten is a neurotoxin. So again, this is just trying to help you understand the relationship between all these things, because it, again, can get very complex. Let's talk now about kind of the different categories of foods and how they relate to increasing histamine. So in this top box here, what you're looking at are histamine-rich foods. These are foods that, when consumed, are very high in histamine and can be very problematic. Now, these foods are worse the older they are. So again, I'm talking leftovers. If you're eating a fresh avocado, right, it's not going to quite have the histamine kick as one that's been sitting around, that you've mashed and it's been sitting out for a day, or it's been in the refrigerator for a few days. So again, anytime you eat these things, these different foods fresh, the histamine levels change. But if you notice, the trend for most of these foods in the high histamine is that most of these, not all, but most of them are aged. Preserved meats are aged, alcohol is aged, fermented foods are aged, dried fruits are aged, cheese is aged. So again, you have to be careful. These ones are big factors, and generally speaking, these are best if you suspect a major histamine response. These foods are best to avoid altogether. And again, a lot of people react to fermented foods. A side note here with fermented foods, there are species of lactobacilli that actually produce histamine. So this is one of the reasons why some people can't eat fermented food like sauerkraut or kombucha, etc. It's because certain strains of lactobacillus have been shown to elevate histamine levels. It's also why some people can't take certain probiotics. So if you've struggled with different types of probiotics, check, because if they're super high in lactobacillus, that may be one of the reasons why. If you struggle with the symptoms of histamine exposure, when you take that probiotic, even though everybody's told you that probiotic is supposed to be so good for you, you've got to be careful. Lactobacillus can do that. That's one of the reasons why we have a particular probiotic I've actually designed. It's very low in lactobacillus, but it's very high in spore probiotic, but also it's high in something called bacteriophages, which can help support the GI tract with this type of situation without creating a flare and histamine response. We also have histamine releasing foods. So what are these foods? These are foods that are not necessarily high in histamine themselves, but that they have chemical properties that increase your body's release of its own histamine. So again, where do we store those histamines? In mast cells. And so these are foods that can activate those cells and lead to basically a production of histamine, or a release of histamine. And so you'll see alcohols in both of these, alcohols in all three categories, but so alcohol is a big no-no. So anybody that I suspect ever that's struggling with a histamine problem, alcohol has to be completely cut out. Otherwise, it's very hard to ever get to the bottom of it. But you see a lot of common foods here: tomatoes and bananas. Wheat germs, a no-no if you're gluten sensitive, obviously. Beans, chocolate, citrus, strawberries, pineapple, mushrooms, nuts, and food additives. Food additives like glutamate and sodium benzoate, or benzoic acid, which is a common ingredient in like club soda, right? So you drink a club soda, you don't think there's going to be a bunch of junk in there, but you got to really read those labels closely. Sulfites, and so those are commonly found in wines, which is why so many people that drink, again, it's activating histamine. And then as well, beyond that, nitrites, which are found a lot of times in your preserved meats, your meat jerkies, etc. So a lot of these food additives additives become histamine releasers. And then there's foods that inhibit or block DAO. Remember, DAO is the enzyme that helps your body naturally get rid of histamine. It breaks it down for you. And so these are foods that can inhibit your body's ability to break down histamine. Alcohol, fermented drinks, okay, this is like beer, right? Fermented ciders and other things. And then teas, especially green tea. I know that may come as a shock to many of you, but caffeine and the green teas can really affect this. And so some people don't do well at all with teas. And some people are drinking them and they're like, why am I feeling so terrible? And they think they're doing something so healthy like drinking green tea and don't even realize that this is what's happening. And then these energy drinks, which I don't like the energy drinks anyway. I think most of them are just caffeine disguised with chemicals and food flavoring agents, and they're already horrible for you, but they can also inhibit DAO. And so you want to try to avoid them. So again, here's your list. If you suspect that you're struggling with a histamine issue, really take into account, because these are the things you can control. You can eliminate and avoid these types of foods. Now, let's talk about some foods you can have, and that way you're not just left hanging with, well, what about this, what about that? So notice there's broad categories here. So what can you have? Fresh meats, key is fresh. Fresh meat and fresh fish. Again, it's the aged stuff where the histamine tends to show up more aggressively. Fresh, non-citrus fruits. So again, it's the citrus that can be activating of histamine. And then we have eggs, and eggs, you know, depending on who you read, eggs can kind of fall into that meat category, but eggs are a good source of low histamine. And then dairy substitutes, so not dairy per se, but dairy substitutes like almond milk, although watch out for the additives in these types of dairy substitutes. And then as well, fresh avocados, except for the ones we mentioned a minute ago, the tomatoes, the avocado, fresh vegetables, the tomatoes, avocado, spinach, and eggplant. And then also from an oil perspective, coconut and olive oil are really excellent choices to pick in terms of oils that are very low histamine. So those are the things that you want to gravitate toward. This other list are the things that you want to gravitate away from. And this way you can at the very least do your part with diet. Now, if we talk about supplementation, what can you do to help your body, to support your body? As I was mentioning earlier, you know, again, eat these foods. One of my favorite, hands down, is vitamin C. Vitamin C is such a powerful mast cell stabilizer. So it helps the mast cells be less aggressive in their release of histamine. This can be very, very effective. It also has natural antihistamine effects. So vitamin C definitely hands down is a winner in the category of, in my experience, of nutrients that play a major role in reducing the potentiation of a histamine release. Now, there are some other natural things as well. I mentioned copper, I mentioned vitamin B6, but I also want to talk about NAC. NAC's on a lot of people's minds. I've seen a lot of questions coming in about NAC today. N-acetylcysteine, and there's, again, there's this fear that N-acetylcysteine is going to be taken off the market. It's not happened yet. It's not happened yet. I'm doing my best to stay heavily stocked for you guys. So, you visit Gluten-Free Society, we're doing our best to keep up. We're gonna have a lot coming in probably sometime next week. So when you go to Gluten-Free Society and you look for that NAC and it's not there, no, we're gonna be hopefully stocked back up for you next week to try to keep you in NAC, because NAC's very critical right now. But NAC is very, very good at helping with, again, with histamine release. So NAC, very, very important. One of my other top nutrients involved in this. Another one is stinging nettle. As a natural plant, stinging nettle has great anti-histamine properties. So nettle, you ever see that? And some people drink nettle tea, during allergy season, because the other thing you got to worry about is if you have environmental allergens where you're allergic to, let's just say, ragweed or pine or other tree type pollens, etc. You coming into allergy season, you already have a histamine problem, so the allergies just ramp up the histamine release by engaging your immune cells. These are great things to do to kind of stabilize your immune cells before allergy season hits. So vitamin C, NAC, stinging nettle, arguably some of my favorite. Quercetin is another one that I love. Quercetin, because of its mast cell stabilizing properties as well. You can get quercetin by eating apples and onions, good sources of natural quercetin in your diet, but supplemental quercetin, very, very effective, very, very good at supporting immune function around histamine response. And if you can take all these together, they have a synergism with each other that help them become even more effective. One of my favorite formulations for people that have high histamine issues is a product called HistAssist. And so what this product, it's not designed so that you can go eat all the high histamine food that you want. It's really designed to use prophylactically to help your immune system and your immune cells stay stable, where they're not just constantly throwing histamine out at you. But when you couple this with low histamine diet, a lot of people, this can be very, very life-changing. And again, it's just using these types of nutrients in a combined fashion to really get that antihistaminic and mast cell stabilizing effect. So nutritionally, these are some of my favorite things to do outside of eating a no allergy diet. If you know you're allergic to certain foods, don't eat them anyway, and just tell yourself you're going to pay a price. So diet's very, very important. Sunshine's important. There's certain nutrients we make when we get out in the sun. Remember, vitamin D, one of the predominant ones that helps our immune system behave appropriately. Vitamin D is like the Goldilocks of the immune system. It helps your system pick out cells that are too strong, pick out cells that are too weak, and keep the ones that are just right. And so that sunshine becomes critical. Sleep becomes critical. Remember, elevations in histamine can block sleep, can make it harder to go to sleep. And so that's where sometimes this can be very, very effective for sleep support as well, because you're helping stabilize those cells that release the excessive histamine. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.